Well, one of the groups I've been working with over the past month has been the Stephen Ministers. Now, Stephen Ministers are lay congregation members trained to provide one-on-one care to those experiencing difficult times in their life, such as grief, divorce, job loss, chronic or terminal illness, or relocation. Now, some people might wonder, why do we need Stephen Ministers? That's why we hired the senior pastor, right? To do that work. Well, here's a case of why we do need Stephen Ministers. Did you know that it's scientifically proven that a human being cannot have any more than 150 close relationships? Now think about that. And now think about your pastor. I have my own family, my own friends outside of church. So my ability to have an intimate relationship with people in my congregation is going to be maxed out at 150 if I have no family and friends. In reality, the number of intimate relationships in the church is going to be 150 people minus the number of relationships I already have. The more friends and family I have outside of church, the smaller my capacity for relationships will be inside the church. Now compare that scientifically proven fact for the limited capacity for intimate friendships with the fact that 2/3 of churches have a worship attendance of less than 100 people. Is this merely a coincidence? Or is this connected to the scientifically proven fact that this is all the people a pastor has the capacity to minister to at any given time? A pastoral-centric church can only grow to the capacity of that one minister. When a pastor is seen as the leader of others, who they minister to the congregation, and then the church's capacity grows exponentially. This is where groups like the Stephen Ministers become valuable for the church. Not just for pastoral care, but for the capacity of growth. Each Stephen Minister goes through 50 hours of training. The leader of the Stephen Minister goes to an additional 50 hours of training. Windermere Union Church is blessed to have a large group of people who have gone through this training. They are trained in pastoral care. I'm going to qualify that in a minute here. Even though these members of the congregation have taken the time to go through this training, others may still be wondering, just how trained are they really? Why in the world would someone in crisis go to a Stephen minister at the church when they have a full-time minister sitting right there in the office? Just go see this minister. Well, that's a great question. Let's entertain what the value of Stephen Ministers are, and are they really qualified to do what we're asking them to do? I'd like to put Stephen Ministers training in perspective. So let's compare the Stephen Minister training to the training of a new full-time pastor, your specific new full-time pastor, or really any pastor out there. For those of you who do not know my background, I have a 4-year undergraduate degree where I majored in philosophy and I minored in religion. During that 4-year degree, I also took one Introduction to Psychology class. That was the same class all freshmen were taking to fulfill their basic requirements. Then I went on to Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, where I received my Master's of Divinity. This is the degree that officially makes me qualified to be a minister. A Master's of Divinity is a 3-year master's program. In order to graduate, I first need to fulfill all the required courses in pastoral counseling, which I am proud to say I did do. I fulfilled all of the required courses in pastoral counseling, which was one 3-credit-hour course that lasted 1 semester. So yeah, that's it. Your new senior pastor only has a 3-credit-hour course that took 1 semester in pastoral counseling, plus the 3-credit-hour course that took 1 semester in Intro to Psychology that I took when I was 18 years old. That's it. So here's the big question. What then makes your senior pastor any more qualified in pastoral care than any of the Stephen ministers. At least their training was more recent. I took Intro to Psychology when I was 18. My very limited training happened decades ago. Now, before anyone begins to panic and think that your search committee hired an underqualified minister, remember what I just said a few minutes ago. I chose my words very carefully. I said that I fulfilled all the requirements for pastoral counseling, which means these were the requirements every pastoral student who goes through seminary and receives a Master of Divinity, their requirement is 3 credit hours in pastoral counseling. Now, unless the minister went above and beyond these requirements and took extra classes, the average minister graduates with 1 class in pastoral counseling. As shocking as this may sound, think of all the areas a minister needs to study. A minister needs to study the Old and the New Testament. In case anyone didn't know, the Bible's a pretty big book. Then on top of studying the actual Bible, the Old and New Testament, the minister needs to take various kinds of theology classes. These classes help a minister gain an understanding of the theological interpretation of the Bible they learned in the other classes. Ministers also need to take classes in preaching, classes in liturgy and worship, classes in church history, church polity, church administration. Ministers need to be a jack of all trades. And there are many different classes and many different subject matters that they need to master before they graduate. Pastoral counseling is just one of these areas. Now compare this to someone who actually gets a degree in counseling. If you have a master's degree in counseling, guess what every single one of those master degree classes covered? Counseling. If someone has a master's degree in psychology, guess what subject all of the classes covered in that master's degree were? Psychology classes. The cold hard truth is that many ministers are embarrassed to tell their congregation the fact that they are not trained counselors. Ministers are not trained counselors. Ministers receive no required training for counseling or intense therapy, no more training than the Stephen ministers took in their 50 hours of training. Now, it's possible that a minister also holds a separate degree in counseling or a separate degree in psychology. But in that case, they are not qualified because they're a minister. They are qualified to do counseling because they have a degree in counseling, a degree in psychology. The whole ministry thing has nothing to do with it. The simple fact is that most ordained clergy are no more trained in counseling than the Stephen ministers. Now, a few decades ago, there was a stigma about going to a psychologist or going to a counselor. But it was acceptable to go to your untrained minister. So this is where a lot of people got their therapy from, their counseling, their advice from their untrained ministers. But it was acceptable in society, even though there was really no training to back that up. But unless these ministers happen to have a dual degree in psychology, the minister's role in counseling should be very limited. And since the Stephen minister has about as much training as the average minister, the role of the senior pastor and Stephen ministers should be seen as equal, but not as equally elevated, an equal reality check. We're here to actively listen, the Stephen minister and the pastor. We're here to actively listen. The Stephen minister and the pastor are here to triage a crisis situation. But even though the average pastor and the Stephen ministers have about the same amount of training, people would still think if they had a choice, well, I'm going to go to the pastor just because it seems like the position of authority, he must be more qualified. But let's look at a couple of examples. If someone got diagnosed with cancer and it's weighing heavy on their heart, so they decide they really need to talk to someone about this devastating news they received, who's the best person to talk to? The senior pastor who thankfully has never had cancer himself, or a Stephen minister who is not only trained to listen, but has battled cancer themselves. They know what it's like to go through chemo. They know the feeling of the weakness in the body and the feeling of despair in the soul. As a pastor, I've been there for many people who've had cancer over my 30-year career. But I do not know what it's like to go through the battle myself. If I had cancer, without question, I would choose to talk to a cancer survivor rather than a senior pastor. Now, those who know me know that I'm very supportive of the LGBTQ community. But I will never know what it's like to come out to my conservative Christian parents. I've talked with many people who've gone through the pain of divorce. But this December, my wife and I will be celebrating 30 years of marriage. I can't possibly know the pain of divorce. But a Stephen minister who's had 50 hours of training, has been through the divorce, and truly understands what that person's going through. They've been there. They're a wounded healer. Again, we need to keep in mind that the Stephen ministers are not trained therapists. That's not the role of the Stephen minister. It's also not the role of the pastor. Pastors and Stephen ministers are trained to listen with compassion. Pastors and Stephen ministers have a purpose, but that purpose is not therapy in any way. Now, many people assume that their pastor is equal or close to a trained counselor, therapist, or psychologist. And I can't stress this enough. I've been doing it through the video so far. That's absolutely not true, not just for me, but for most ministers, regardless of what they say, unless you see a degree hanging on their wall in counseling or psychology. Now, again, I mentioned earlier, 30, 40, or 50 years ago, going to a psychologist had a huge stigma in our society. But going to their pastor was completely acceptable and in some traditions even expected to go. But today, professional therapists are much more the norm, and they're accepted by the vast majority of our society. In fact, today, the statistic is that 1 in 5 people have seen some kind of a therapist in the past 12 months. Think about that as you look around the church on Sunday morning. 1/5 of the church has seen a trained therapist this year. As going to a trained therapist becomes more and more the commonplace in our society, we need to have a more clearly defined role for both the minister and the Stephen ministers. They're here to listen. They're here to be that frontline support in a crisis situation. They're here to provide just support and love with everyday struggles in life. This is why we're beginning to add to the roles of the Stephen ministers the tasks of hospitality. The Stephen ministers will still be available for their traditional role of compassionate, active listening. But on our video on hospitality, we talked about how most people seeking a new church are going through some kind of a crisis. This crisis may simply be that they moved. This shouldn't be minimalized. Moving is a life transition. But there's also many other reasons why people are looking for a new church. They went through a divorce and they no longer feel like they can attend the same church as their spouse. Maybe they came out and their church asked them to leave when they came out of the closet, or at least maybe made to feel unwelcome, so they just felt like they needed to leave. Maybe the visitor received some serious medical news, looking to get closer with God or just looking for answers. There are many reasons why people visit the church for the first time. Often that first visit happens because someone is going through some kind of a spiritual crisis and they're looking for something. That's why they come to church. And that's what makes the Stephen minister a perfect fit for hospitality. The Stephen ministers are not greeting the visitor as a commodity, hoping that they turn this visitor into some kind of a future tither for the church. They're not looking at the visitor and sizing them up for, I wonder what committee we can sucker them to serve on. The Stephen minister is going to be looking at each visitor with compassion, not how that visitor can eventually someday serve us, but how can we as a church serve that visitor? What hurt and pain or anxiety does that visitor bring with them into the sanctuary during that first visit? What can we do to care for that visitor throughout the entirety of that first day and not just a quick 30-second hi, how you doing? In what way can we build an intimate support network around that visitor to support them in whatever needs they bring to the church? Beyond hospitality, Stephen ministers are going to be also divided up throughout the entire church. We're going to take the entire church membership with our new church management program, and we are going to divide the church up among the Stephen ministers. The goal is that at least once a month, each family in the church will be personally contacted in some way or another. A card, a phone call, text message, any form of communication. It doesn't matter how they're contacted. What matters is that each family is contacted. A simple hello, how are you doing? We've been thinking of you. The goal is to prevent people from falling through the cracks, to provide another connection to the church or family member to communicate their concerns with if they do have concerns that arise. Most people hold their concerns close to their chest. On Sunday morning, most people in the sanctuary do not share their concerns. Usually, let's be honest, it's the same kind of cross-section of the congregation who's sharing, which is wonderful. But even when they're sharing concerns about other people. People usually keep their own struggles private. But herein lies the problem. We've talked about before how the pitfalls of sharing someone else's concern during the live stream and worship, that's a big problem. But the other thing we need to address is, again, I mentioned before, it's only a handful of people sharing other people's concerns. What about the rest of the church who have unspoken concerns? They don't want to share them with the entirety of the congregation. They don't want to share them live streaming. And they don't necessarily call the office and tell the office they're going through a problem. The challenge is that people typically do not advertise their struggles in life. At the same time, they also feel abandoned by the church when the church does not support them during their time of need. I know it sounds illogical. How can someone be angry at the church for not reaching out to them when they never told the church what their problem is? But that is a very, 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 very common thing in a church. When you're hurting, you don't reach out, but you expect people to reach into you. How are we going to know that you're in pain? It's impossible for the pastor to support someone in their time of need if the pastor does not know about their time of need. The church needs to have multiple channels for people to privately and confidentially share their concerns outside of announcing them in front of the live stream. The church did not have a prayer request page when I first came to the church. One of the first things we got up and running, we now have a prayer request page on the website as just one of multiple avenues for people to share privately and confidentially a prayer concern. A requested field on that particular form that people would fill out for the prayer request is, it's a required field, is to select whether or not this prayer would be private or public. And if it's listed private, no one else is going to know about it. The confidentiality of that prayer is going to be respected. The second thing that was not happening outside of the COVID years was that system that we talked about earlier about contacting various people in the church each month to just kind of make sure everyone's staying in contact with the church, that somehow they feel connected. And we're going to try to put that in place as well. And if nothing is shared between those conversations, so when the Stephen minister reaches out to the various people in the church, it might just be a hi, how you doing, and nothing shared, but at least that's another door that's open where they might feel like telling the Stephen minister maybe something personal going on in their life, a prayer concern that would be unspoken otherwise, and we would never know about it unless they had these continued contacts from the Stephen ministers, just checking in and seeing how they're doing. Now, in the retention video, we talked about the importance of connecting people to small groups. This will build intimate relationships. And if a person is attending this church for any period of time, but has not formed an intimate relationship, then who are they going to confide in when they're going through a difficult time of need? So, talking about the spiritual care of people, we need to build that retention aspect. We need to build those small groups, get people involved where they really don't just know who someone is, know their name, say hi to them during the Passion of the Peace. They need to build an intimate relationship with a small group of people in a church through a ministry you're engaged in, through Sunday school, through fellowship time, whatever, but build those intimate relationships. That's, again, how these personal stories are going to be told so the pastor or the Stephen minister can then care for them in a meaningful way. So moving forward in this church, the Stephen ministers are going to play a very important role in the spiritual care of the members of this church.